Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar to introduce the NCAI Fund's Victim Services Microgrant Program. This webinar is co-hosted by the National Congress of American Indians, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and First Pick 8. My name is Esther Labrado, and I am an enrolled citizen of the North Fork Rancheria of Mono Indians and a descendant of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, and I'm a project attorney at NCAI. So I want to thank you all for joining. And before we begin, we'll go over some quick housekeeping tips and let you all know how you can participate in today's webinar. So on your screen, you should see the viewer window, which is where you can see the actual PowerPoint. And then on the right side of your screen, you should see a control panel that looks like the image on the PowerPoint. And if you don't see it, look for the small orange arrow. Sometimes the control panel minimizes itself. So if you just click on the orange arrow, the control panel will open. You'll be able to see all of the features. At the top of your control panel, you'll see the audio controls, and we recommend calling in using your telephone as it provides the best audio connection. And to do so, you'll need to click on the Use Telephone option, which will then display the phone number to call in, including your audio pin. Below the audio box is the questions and chat box. And there you can go ahead and type any questions throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring the box, and feel free to kind of stop us at any point to ask questions. Another feature you can use is the raise your hand option, which is below the orange arrow, and it's an image of a hand with an arrow on it. And if you click on that, it will signal to us that you have a question, and we can go ahead and unmute your line and allow you to ask your question verbally. So either way, please feel free to ask questions throughout. And today's webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar, you'll receive an evaluation, and then we will also be posting the recorded version of the webinar online at tribalvictimservices.org, and we'll have that URL up later in the presentation. So I want to thank you all again for joining us. And the goal of today's webinar is really to provide an overview of a new funding opportunity for crime victim services for eligible tribal nations. And today's presenters are Virginia Davis, Senior Advisor at the National Congress of American Indians, Lana Hunter, Tribal Victim Resource Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and Kelly Crow, Project Director at First Pick Incorporated. I'll turn it over to you, Virginia. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Esther, and welcome everybody. We're excited to have you join us today. I'm going to just give a quick overview of this new funding the NCAI has available, and then I will turn it over to our partners to talk a little bit more. Can you go to the next slide, please? So before talking specifically about the funding, we just like to kind of ground ourselves in a reminder of, what the work is all about and what the problem and challenges that we are hoping this funding will help communities address. And so on this slide, you've got some of the the statistics about the rates of violent victimization in Indian country. We know that Indians and Alaska Natives are experiencing violence at a rate at least twice the national average, and that over 83% of both Native men and women report that they've experienced violence in their lifetime. What's another noteworthy thing that we know from the research in this area is that when Native people experience violent victimization, they are more likely to need services as a result of that victimization than white victims or victims of other races, meaning they're more likely to have physical injuries or require counseling or other services. And despite being more likely to need those services, they are less likely to have access to those services. And so there's been a big focus over the last few years to try and help build out the crime victim services infrastructure in tribal communities to try and help ensure that when victimization occurs, that victims have access to the services that they need to heal. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding that NCAI has to make available to tribes, where it comes from. And some of this is on the slide, and some of it isn't. But the main source of funding that the federal government has to support crime victim services comes from something called the Crime Victims Fund. And the Crime Victims Fund was first established back in 1984. And since that time, it has funded victim services programs in the states and in the territories. But Indian tribes were left out of that largely until a few years ago. So when the 1984 bill was passed, there wasn't really a thought about providing direct funding to tribes. That's obviously been a huge, that was a huge omission, was a huge challenge, and something that many people spent a lot of time lobbying Congress to change. And finally, that happened. And starting in FY18, so a couple of years ago now, Congress started directing a portion of the money that comes from the Crime Victims Fund every year to go directly to tribes to provide crime victim services in tribal communities. So that money was first made available to tribes by the Department of Justice in fiscal year 18. Unfortunately, DOJ has had, it hasn't been smooth. Their efforts to stand up this new program. There have been a lot of challenges. They haven't been able to reach tribal communities where there's a need. And in FY18, DOJ actually returned a portion of the money to the Crime Victims Fund rather than giving it out to Indian country, which was obviously really disappointing and frustrating and enraging to folks who knew that there was so much need in Indian country to see that money go back rather than getting distributed. In FY19, DOJ made the funding available again through a competitive grant program. And as they got down to the wire of the deadline they had to distribute the money, they realized that, once again, they weren't going to be able to get it all out to the tribes. And so at that point, they approached NCAI and asked us if we would be willing to help pass through the money to some of the tribes who hadn't chosen to or hadn't been able to access it directly. And so that's the origin of the money that NCAI now has to pass through to tribes. And that if you were invited to join this webinar, that you are eligible to apply for the pass-through funding from NCAI. So we have about $11 million that we are passing through pursuant to a cooperative agreement with the Department of Justice. And so DOJ set the terms of who's eligible for the funding that NCAI has available. And our funding is only available to tribes outside Alaska. And the reason for that is that DOJ provided another chunk of money to an organization in Alaska to pass through funds to the tribes up there. And our money is only available to tribes in the lower 48 who did not receive money from DOJ in FY18 or FY19. Again, if you received a communication from NCAI telling you about the funding opportunity and inviting you to this call, then that means you are eligible for this funding and are not one of the tribes who DOJ said, isn't eligible because they received money from them directly. I know that can be a little bit confusing, so we're happy. Please, ask questions or raise your hand if any of that needs to be clarified. But the total award amount that NCAI will be passing through, again, under the terms of our agreement with DOJ, our awards can't exceed $350,000. And the grant period will be October 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2022. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a map, a graphic map to show you, the relationships and the team. So as I said, the money originated with the DOJ Office for Victims of Crime. They entered into a cooperative agreement with us at the National Congress of American Indians Fund. And now we are looking to make sub-grant agreements with the eligible tribal nations who will be grantees. So I wanted to stress that this is ultimately a federal pass-through grant. So we as the cooperative agreement partner with DOJ and NCAI, are bound to the federal regulations and policies that apply to federal funding, and the tribal nation grantees will be as well. So I just wanted to be sure to flag that. I also wanted to talk about some of the partners that we've brought in to help us with this project. The Tribal Law and Policy Institute is going to be providing technical assistance to all of the interested tribes and the tribal grantees throughout the life of the project. They will be available to help tribes figure out how to apply or what to apply for, how to build their budgets, etc., and then available to help with, provide technical assistance with implementation of projects and grants as well. And Lana Hunter will be speaking to you in just a moment, and I'll let her introduce herself to you then. The third project partner working with us is First Pick Incorporated, and they are going to be assisting with the financial and programmatic support for our grantees. So I'm going to introduce Kelly Crow from First Pick and let her tell you a little bit more about First Pick's role in the project.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you everybody for joining. As Virginia was sharing, First Pick has joined as the financial and programmatic technical assistance support for the project. Our organization has been around for about 20 years, and we've provided training and technical assistance to grantees across multiple agencies, including Department of Justice and HUD. And for this project, what we're going to mainly be doing is working with the organizations that are eligible under the grant to receive funding, so that we can kind of ease the burdens that Virginia was sharing that tend to come along with federal funding. So working with folks on putting together a budget that is allowable, making sure that people understand the documentation that is needed, working with folks on the procurement process, all of those things that we're required to make sure folks do because it's federal funding, but we know often can create a little bit of headache for folks. The whole goal here is to make sure that you all can focus on providing services to victims of crimes and not have to worry too much about the administrative components of the grant. So mainly just wanting to share that, if you do decide to apply, if you do decide to participate, we will be there kind of as a partner with you throughout to kind of walk you through the process and make sure that everything's done correctly. And we look forward to working with everyone.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Next slide. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about who is eligible for this funding, a little more than I've already mentioned. Again, it's federally recognized tribes outside Alaska who did not receive money directly from DOJ's Office for Victims of Crime in FY18 or FY19. So the applicant itself may be the eligible tribal nation. That's, we assume most of the applicants will be the tribes themselves, but if a tribe wants to join with other eligible tribes to apply as a consortia, that's also fine. Or if you have an existing consortia that it makes sense to have apply for this funding, that works for us too. Or if a tribe wants to designate an organization to apply on their behalf, maybe you work in close partnership with a nonprofit organization or an existing victim service provider who you would like to designate to apply on your behalf, that is also fine. And we're happy to answer any questions about that. The one thing we would say is if the applicant is a consortia or a designee organization, we will ask that they provide appropriate documentation that they are authorized by the tribe prior to finalizing the award. Obviously, we want to make sure that the tribes have appropriately authorized whoever ends up applying. Next slide, please. Okay. So I want to talk briefly about the application process. We are at step one. You can see from this slide it's a two-step application process. Right now we are in step one, where we've asked you to basically raise your hand and let us know if you're interested in the funding by submitting a statement of interest. That's a very simple online form you'll fill out, and we've asked that they be submitted by June 26th. you'll see, if you haven't already checked it out on the online form, that you don't need to have a fully developed proposal and a fully developed budget. We're really just looking for a summary statement of how you might use the money and an estimate of how much money you might be requesting. Neither of those will be binding. You can change your mind later in the process, but we're just trying to get a sense of it. After step 1, there'll be a step 2 where you will submit a full application. That'll be due August 21st of 2020. Expect that that we'll open that up on July 13th. So that'll be the time period where you're working on step 2. And for step 2, you'll do a summary project proposal and a summary budget. And throughout that process, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute will be working with the interested tribes to help them, develop those project proposals and budgets, or provide whatever other support is useful. Next slide, please. And this is just showing that application process in a more visual way. The brown boxes reflect, kind of when the tribe will be working on things, and the green boxes reflect when we will be reviewing. So again, step 1 due June 26, 2020, and then it'll come to us. And what we'll be doing between step 1 and step 2 is really just looking to confirm that everybody is eligible, everybody who completed step 1, which will include checking to make sure that you're not disbarred by the federal government from receiving federal funds. Then we'll release, we'll send you an invitation to finish your step 2 application. That'll be due again August 21st. And then we will review all of the applications to think about the viability of the proposal, the risk of noncompliance with federal statutes, and and kind of geographic distribution of the awards. And then we plan to let the tribes know about their awards and get things finalized by October. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lana Hunter at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to talk a little bit more about the grant opportunity, what kinds of things you can fund with this grant opportunity. And again, we're happy to answer any questions. I don't know, as we transition to Lana, Esther, are there any questions now that we should address?
There's no questions at this time, and just as a reminder, you can use both the questions and chat function within your control panel, again, clicking on the orange arrow if it has minimized, or you can click on the raise your hand button, and we'll flag that as well, but no questions at this time.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Lana.
Thank you, Virginia. This is Lana Hunter, and I'm from the Sisseton-Wakbetuan Dakota tribe, since it's in South Dakota, and my father's people are from the Tlingit Nation in Southeast Alaska. I worked for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, which is a national tribal technical assistance provider, and specifically on this grant, I am providing technical assistance to tribes along with a team at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Next slide. So our role is really to assist tribes, where our understanding is that these are the 205 remaining tribes of our 573 tribes that have not received this OVC set-aside funding. And so we wanted to be able to work with NCAI to meet the needs of tribes, whether it be capacity, whether it be setting up, programming. So we wanted to be able to go over on this webinar, what are some of the things that you can apply for under the NCAI Fund microgrant. So we looked at the needs in Indian country and understand that many of us may or may not understand or are meeting the needs for victims in their tribal communities. So one of the opportunities is to apply for a community needs assessment to really look at what the needs are in the community. And this can be done with victims, obviously in a confidential way, or this can be looking at the tribal systems, tribal justice systems within our tribal communities, which may include multi-jurisdictional, state, federal, county agencies as well, to assess really what the gaps in safety are. And the additional is to develop a strategic plan based on those needs assessment results to either improve or expand existing victim services. Many tribes have domestic violence or sexual assault programming. However, they may or may not have services for elder abuse or trafficking, sex trafficking victims, or stalking, dating violence. So expanding it to also meet the needs that we see around either identity theft or robbery, so expanding the crime areas as well. This is also an opportunity to purchase equipment and supplies. So the equipment and supplies could range from computers to expand. During this COVID time, we found that many of our tribal programs had to work from home or work remotely. So you may or may not have been able to assess the need for computers, printers, scanners, cell phones, or office supplies. So this is that opportunity to look at what the existing needs are, or again, expanding the needs. This is also the opportunity to apply for vehicles or security systems at a victim services facility and or tribal court to place cameras outside the facilities, or additionally remote access equipment in court so that folks may be able to call in remotely. I know that many of our tribal courts as well as state courts were not in their courtrooms, and so many of them were having to come up with ways to also continue with court, because at the end of the day, it really is about safety. Also implementing program activities, including the personnel costs to support victims of crime. And we have included a chart which is located on our website at www.tribalvictimservices.org. So this chart is the expansive list from the Office of Victims of Crime. So if you just scroll through it, you'll see anything from personnel, as we explained a little bit of that, all the way to what can be included in terms of fringe benefits, travel, mileage, supplies. So this is a list that is located on our website. You all should have received just a short list, a one-pager that explains the opportunity, the allowable and unallowable costs, but this is the more expansive list. So this is located on our website under technical assistance, under frequently asked questions. Thank you. Next slide. So as we mentioned, training and technical assistance is available. And again, this is for tribes who may have applied for the OVC funding in the past and possibly been denied. And so working with you to kind of look at other funding resources that you have available, and also looking at what the allowable or unallowable costs are, also understanding victim services program, but maybe not understanding what can be funded under those areas. So we are available to do technical assistance, and my information is located on the screen in front of you. This PDF or PowerPoint is also located on your right-hand side in the handout section. So we have the frequently asked questions as well as the PowerPoint. So this is available for your use. Next slide, please. So how do you apply? So you should have all received an eligibility letter if you are here today. In that letter, we also had the step 1 of our application. However, if you're familiar and have gone to our website, we also have it located on our website. So if you go to www.tribalvictimservices.org, there is a tab to request funding. to complete the statement of interest. So if you scroll down to the very bottom of the page under the Request Funding tab, there's a statement of interest box that is located there. So this is the direct link, as you can see on your screen. So if you click on that tab under Application Deadlines, click on the Statement of Interest, there will be a handful of questions that we ask under the Statement of Interest, which we will go over now. It's not an exhaustive list, and as Virginia mentioned earlier, this is actually the opportunity for us at NCAI to look at internally what the request need is, but also really to assess the types of programming, and it also cues the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to go through, either existing programming, expanding programming, but providing technical assistance. So you'll see on your screen that you are, we're asking for your entity name, your tribal name, as well as information about grant administrations or points of contact. And the reason we ask for points of contact is for the technical assistance portion. So you'll see if this is grant administration filling out the application, that really we're looking for additionally the person that we would contact to provide technical assistance. Next slide. So as we're looking at the specific questions within the statement of interest, we are really asking, are you seeking funding for a new or existing program? Next slide, please. So, and the reason we're asking is what is the capacity that you currently have within your tribe? Do you have an existing program, or is this a new program or an expanding program? So we are really looking at what is the capacity of the tribe to take on, whether it's new, existing, or expanding services. And we are not asking for any lengthy amount of information. We're really looking for 3 to 5 sentences. This is not the full funding request. Again, this is just the statement of interest, and we are just trying to understand the interest from the 205 tribes that are eligible. And under each of these slides, I've included examples of what you could use the funding for. So again, this is looking at developing a victim services program. So this would be a new victim services program. Maybe it's a very specific program under elderly services, so expanding that, or brand new. So as a first step, you would like to conduct a needs assessment and begin strategic planning. So you could utilize this funding to develop a new program. So part of that planning process is maybe hiring a consultant or appointing someone within the tribe who maybe works in existing programming or in administration to develop the needs assessment and strategic plan. And again, we'll be offering technical assistance to develop both a needs assessment and strategic plan. So walking you through what that would look like. But again, this is looking at new programming. Next slide, please. So again, this is purchasing supplies. We have a specific question in our statement of interest about the understanding of purchasing a vehicle to transport victims to access necessary services or attend court proceedings. One of the things that we know in Indian country is that we are very remote. The services that we have for victims are limited. Oftentimes we are transporting victims either to or from federal courts, depending on our jurisdiction, could be state court proceedings, and those are never usually close by, as well as accessing any type of services for forensic sexual assault for either youth, children, or adults. Oftentimes we see tribes traveling upwards of 2 hours, 4 hours round trip to access the nearest services for that purpose. In addition, oftentimes we see that shelter programs are not located within our communities, and having to travel to a local state, county, township to bring a victim to safety. So we provided this opportunity as a way to access if you need vehicles for that very specific purpose. And so we also additionally ask a question, again, this is to understand the capacity of the tribe. Perhaps you've had other programs, grants in the past that also required either a needs assessment or strategic plan that you're working around. This is really just for us to understand internally what your capacity is to respond to these tribes, the needs of victims in your tribes. So again, this is just a yes or no question. So we just included examples on the bottom. So again, this is laptops, cell phones, desk chairs, purchasing a vehicle, a generator for tribal domestic violence shelter program, security systems, again, for tribal courts, as well as domestic violence shelters or programs. So these are, again, examples of what you can apply for with the NCAI microgrants. Next slide, please. So what we really want to understand is just a general ballpark area of what you believe that you may be requesting. So understanding that, you know, right now you may think it is in the range of 50 to 100,000, and so you check that box. But you find that down the road, when the full RFP is released on July 13th, it's going to be more towards the 100 and 200,000 range. So part of our goal is just really to understand what you believe that you think you may need to provide the services, the programming, the supplies that you're requesting. Again, this is the statement of interest, so this is in no way a binding, this is really just a ballpark figure for us internally to understand, where the resources may be going towards. So additionally, I've added another example on the bottom. So one of the things that we see when we work with Indian country is that the capacity to respond to many of the crimes, whether it be domestic violence, sexual assault, robbery, stalking, dating violence, and stalking may include electronic messages, social media. We find that many of our tribal communities may not have updated codes to respond or for the prosecution to move forward. Many of the areas that we see, are around issues of stalking, robbery, identity theft, stalking around social media, harassment, those types of things. So one of the ways that we understand for many tribes is to either begin with a needs assessment, strategic planning, and or expanding their tribal codes, and understanding that there are some specific federal requirements for codes based on federal funding, and we can work with you on those as well. Or understanding, victim rights within your tribal communities. Oftentimes, what we see with victim rights at a state level is that it requires a police report in order for those victim rights to be enacted. And for what we know, working with victims, that should never be the opportunity for them to heal, should never be pending on a tribal police report, because we may not know or understand the reason why they're not reporting the crime that they've experienced. However, that should not hinder them from accessing services, accessing safe shelter, accessing safety planning, transportation to court, or transportation to housing. Additionally, any other services that they may need, whether that includes substance use disorder, mental health counseling. So that really should never be a deterrent. So this is the opportunity for tribes to really enact their sovereignty and not follow just state or federal victim rights, but really to look at your own internal victim rights and understand that we have culture, we have our language, we have our ways of taking care of our relatives, and oftentimes that includes ceremonies, access to safe spiritual leaders, cultural items, for gifting, or it also includes the opportunity to have the chance to do traditional or cultural medicines, healing. What does that look like within our tribal communities? So this is really a chance for us to expound on our existing codes to make them more inclusive and more reflective of our tribal communities. Next slide, please. So this is one of the last questions that we ask on the statement of interest. And again, asking this question here is really flagging you for the full RFP. If you have the authority to apply for grants on behalf of your tribal nation, if you do not at the time of submitting this statement of interest know that you have time to have those discussions, to pass those resolutions, to do the work necessary, the groundwork necessary to work with the tribal nation and or nations. So if you're submitting as a consortia or designee, which tribal nations do you represent? And so, we can work with you on what that looks like, submitting as a consortia or designee, or if you're a nonprofit working with a tribe, what does that look like? So again, these are all opportunities for us to provide technical assistance as you're working through the statement of interest, working towards the full application. Next slide, please. So as we're working towards that full application, we won't go over this, in extensive detail today. We wanted to more introduce the statement of interest, really just to kind of break it down so that it's as simple as possible. It's by no means a deterrent, but really to get you thinking about the full application. So step one, which we just went over, is due June 26th. 2020. So you will be contacted once you submit an application or statement of interest, contacted once we have confirmed the eligibility, and then you will be contacted by the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to follow up with technical assistance to answer any questions that you may have. And then once that statement of interest is submitted, and we have that understanding, and you have completed all the steps necessary and eligibility is confirmed, you'll be invited via email from our team to submit a full application. And so step two of that full application will be due August 21, 2020. So we will be offering training and technical assistance via webinars as well as outreach. Next slide, please. And if you want to learn more about the types of technical assistance that we have, or to get in contact with us, or to register for upcoming webinars, this is our website located on the screen, and upcoming webinars, next slide, that we have. In addition to the one that you're on today, we have a program planning webinar, and this is really to get those ideas and questions around expanding existing victim services, what it is that you are looking to apply for, how can that expand, or in what is allowable, what is unallowable, and also, what other considerations should you be reflecting on as you're submitting the statement of interest. So we really want to just provide that opportunity for program planning, what can be funded, and include this discussion of addressing gaps in safety. So oftentimes, folks think, we don't have an existing program, we want to start a new program. There are considerations for working with victims of crime, and that just really includes looking at the different tribal justice systems. Are they set up currently to respond to the needs of victims of crime? Our goal is really to address the gaps in safety, but we also don't want to re-traumatize any victims if our systems are not set up to respond. So this is an opportunity on our next program planning webinar to address and discuss some of those potentials of gaps in safety. Next slide. So the technical assistance for step 2. So again, we're not going to go into that and expand on that too much, but we will have additional webinars for step 2, which includes the program development. So looking kind of at a deeper dive of what program design that you'll, considerations that you should consider as you undertake these kind of next steps in walking through the questions in the full application, as well as providing sample budget, summary budgets. And again, there will be an opportunity for you to work with First Pick that they were on the call earlier or on the webinar earlier to develop a budget that is expansive, but also addresses the very specific requirements from OVC. So next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Virginia, to talk about the OVC Tribal Victim Set-Aside.
Yeah, and we just wanted to mention this, anticipating it might be a question for some, although based on who's in attendance today, I'm not sure it's relevant for you all. But OVC, the Office for Victims of Crime at DOJ, for the first time this year, they are releasing their funding as a formula program. So all eligible tribes or all interested tribes are eligible to receive an allocation under a formula that includes base funding plus some population-based adjustments. And we know that a handful of tribes applied, are for the OVC formula program, but are otherwise also eligible for our grant funding opportunity. And so for those tribes, that's fine. They can do both. If you think you're in that situation, let us know. We're happy to talk it through. The only requirement is that you need to you need to use the funds for different purposes. They can't be duplicative, since if you're getting paid already to do something through the OVC formula grant, you can't get paid twice for the same thing. For those of you that are not in the OVC formula pipeline this year, it's one of the things that we will be working with our grantees on is to explore that funding opportunity. We expect it to be an annual formula distribution, and so if you while our funding, the NCAI microgrant, will be one-time funding, we hope that the tribes that participate in our funding will consider, kind of getting in the pipeline for the OVC formula funding in the years to come, if you choose to do that. So we'll be talking about that with our grant recipients more.
Thank you, Virginia. Next slide. So again, before we move to any questions that you folks may have, again, we just want to highlight our Tribal Victim Services .org, and there are a ton of resources as well located under technical assistance, frequently asked questions, as well as the opportunity to request funding, sign up for upcoming webinars, and maybe even just learn a little bit more about the background of this, other than what you learned on the call today for the NCAI Fund microgrant. We have the technical assistance, which is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and you have that information. But if there are general inquiries, questions that you may have that are not pertaining to technical assistance, there is a email located on your screen, microgrants@ncai.org. You'll get in touch directly with our folks at NCAI to ask any questions that you may have. And again, if you have any technical assistance, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Esther.
Great, thank you. So just as a reminder, and we have some instructions on the screen as well, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the questions box. Again, so that's clicking on the little orange arrow, which will open your control panel, and then you can type your question there. Alternatively, if you want to ask your question verbally, go ahead and just click on the little icon with a hand and an arrow, and we can unmute your line and have you ask your question that way. At this time, it doesn't look like we have any questions, but I want to give everyone a few minutes to think of any. So if we want to go to the next slide and go ahead and have our contact information up. As Lana mentioned, we have, there's the website, tribalvictimservices.org. There's also the primary email account, which is microgrants@ncai.org. And then there's our personal contact information on the screen as well, if you have any additional questions. And I'm not seeing any others come in. As I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the website. I also want to just direct everyone to the handouts box. We did include 2 handouts for you today. So that's similarly in your control panel. In the handout section, we have a copy of the PowerPoint from today, and as well we have the frequently asked questions document, and the frequently asked questions are also available online, but we wanted to have an easier resource for you. And with that, do you have any other kind of final comments from our panelists?
Just that we're excited to work with everybody, and to please, reach out if there's any way we can be of help as you navigate this process. So thank you.
And I would just like to thank everyone for attending today. I think that it's important to understand that NCAI has really done a great job in providing technical assistance for this process, and to really just look forward to working with each one of you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, we hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Stay healthy, and let us know if you have any questions.